Hunter and I have set up a little bush camp here in this beautiful pine forest, but it has been raining, pouring in fact, for the past 2 days, and intermittently the sun shines here and there, but the materials remain wet. This poses a challenge to fire making, and it doesn't matter what environment you find yourself in, you might end up with wet materials because of the weather or because of the circumstances. Just now I want to show you a couple of things that you can do to source dry materials even in a wet environment. But if you understand how the fire triangle works and how those three elements of oxygen, a combustible material, and heat work together to give you fire, you can problem solve any sort of fire making situation. Whether you're at camp and you're just trying to get the exact right temperature to braai your steak to medium rare, or you're trying to make a survival fire, you can apply these principles to ensure that you get a fire and you keep it going every time. I'm Clarice. Welcome to the Live Ready channel. It is cold out here, hey? So when I get into a new environment, I like to do a little resource walk just to scope out what I've got available to me. And in my honest opinion, if you found a pine tree, you've won. Because pine trees have so much resin in them, not just in the fat wood that you find from a pine tree, but also in, where are you going? It's raining out there. But also in the pine needles themselves. They actually burn really, really well, especially if you've only got a few embers and you want to rekindle that fire. Putting some pine needles on there, even if they're not 100% dry, I found that they actually light really well. What's going on? All right, so there is a nice piece of fat wood in the area that I've seen. I'm gonna go harvest it and I'll take you with me and show you what fat wood is and how you can use an accelerant from the environment to get your fire going in this kind of weather. It's actually getting really wet in here. All right, let's go hunt. So here's the thing about the fire triangle. You have oxygen, you have a heat source, and you've got a combustible material. The question is your combustible material able to absorb or accept the heat that you're giving to it? In other words, is the heat source hot enough for what you're providing it as fuel for? And is that combustible material exposed to the heat source for long enough in order for it to actually accept the heat and ignite? So for example, if you've got a ferro rod and you are using it to light a tinder bundle, is your tinder bundle fine enough? Has the fibers been processed well enough to accept a very short spark, or a spark that it's exposed to for a very short time? Even though a ferro rod, or what you would call a fire steel, has got a really high burning spark, so it's just under 3,000 degrees. That spark is there and gone so quickly. So your tinder bundle needs to accept that spark in such a short time. Whereas if you've got a lighter, for example, a lighter flame burns at just under 2,000 degrees, but you can hold it to the whatever source you're trying to burn for as long as you've got gas in the lighter. So a candle, for example, will light with a lighter, but not with a fire steel. So then again, you have to ask yourself, what am I providing heat to? What does my combustible material look like? And what does my heat source look like? So over here, I've got a beautiful example of a bit of fat wood that I've come to source from in the past. I'm actually going to take it today. It is a very nice source of fat wood that I can use for future. And it's even like dripping and leaking some resin over here. So this is a pine tree, it's a red pine. Yeah, 2 needles, yeah, red pine. And this is what you would almost call standing deadwood. So usually in a pine forest, you would find some trees that have a broken branch or something. The branch dies, but the resin that's inside that branch seeps down to the bottom of the branch and it accumulates here. So that's a very nice example of where to find fat wood. Don't make a mistake thinking though that a live branch doesn't have resin in it. I have actually broken a branch off of a pine tree that's been a perfectly green branch and found that it has a bit of fat wood sitting in it. And where I broke the branch off actually started dripping resin a little bit later as well. So you can actually find resin sitting in live branches as well. For today, I'm just going to take this one. All these branches are in my way. By the way, if you've got a really good way to get resin off of a silky saw blade, please leave that in the comments. I'm definitely going to need that. Trying to get as much of that as possible without wasting any. Ooh, that is beautiful. Look at that. Oh wow, that smells amazing. Just look at that. Perfect example of a beautiful bit of fatwood. That is just the perfect example of fatwood. That is exactly what it looks like. So I mentioned that the combustible material, the heat source, and the amount of oxygen or ventilation you give your fire is all going to play a role in whether or not you get that fire going in the first place. But all of those things also apply to the environment. And if you have a hard time applying these principles, think about your own body. If you lie down on the ground and it's wet, you're going to lose heat to the ground. If you are right on the ground, you might actually even get some of that moisture on your clothing. And the moisture, as well as the cold of the ground, is also going to sap heat from the fire. Also, fires draw up moisture from the ground. In other words, because heat rises, it can actually put itself out if whatever is underneath it is wet enough. So I've had this before where I've made fire, you can call it a swamp fire, where I've made fire on the water, and what it does is it just absolutely absorbs, it pulls all of that moisture in and it just puts itself out. So having a dry surface on which to start your fire is already going to make a big difference to whether or not the fire keeps going. And then there are other things, like I've chosen this specific spot for my camp because I've got a nice big rock here. So when we think about oxygen, we should also think about wind and what the wind does to our fire. Interestingly enough, I was speaking to a friend of mine in the week. He works offshore and he works a lot with gases because he dives. And he said that, ironically, for a gas to be considered flammable, it only needs 6% oxygen in it. In the atmosphere, we've got 21% oxygen. So there's enough oxygen to go around. And if you're trying to troubleshoot fire making, the likely culprits for your fire going out is either your combustible resource isn't accepting the heat that you're providing, or the heat that you're providing is not enough or not provided for long enough. In other words, your combustible material is not being exposed for long enough. And this is how making a fire to braai a steak, for example, applies. If you've got something like a shield that prevents heat being lost to the one side, then what happens, instead of the heat escaping that way and all the other directions, the heat is now prevented from escaping in that direction, so more heat is concentrated towards your fireplace. It's not necessarily that it's radiated back, it's just that the wind doesn't blow it away, it doesn't escape that way, so the heat is basically trapped in this space in a sense. And if you don't believe me, wait until you're really cold and wet and you make a fire to try and keep warm. Having basically a shield for your fire makes a massive difference to how much heat you get from that fire. I didn't believe it at first myself. Go and try it. All right, so to get to the fatwood here, I'm just removing the bark. If it's dry bark, keep it. Anything that's dry that you can find, keep that aside, put it under your shelter, make sure it stays dry so that you can use it at a later stage. This is a beautiful piece of fatwood. Alrighty. Okay, so I'm just looking for whatever is kind of dry in the area, and I'm just stacking it here. Obviously the ground isn't dry, so what I want to prevent moisture being drawn up from the ground into my fire. If my heat source, like a ferro rod for example, because it's such a short time of exposure to the heat source, doesn't really count as a 3000 degree heat source. Because of that, I want to give my fire the best chance of lighting the first time around. Right, so I've been taking some of these fatwood shavings and just keeping them. Now you can, of course, use some really dry materials. But if it's raining, like it's like intermittently raining here, then a resinous material, especially fine shavings of a resinous material, is actually going to give you the best chance of lighting with a ferro rod. There are other ways to do this though. You can use something like motor oil in a fish tin with a paper towel, and that's a really good way to demonstrate your combustible material. All right, so just some shavings. And then of course, if you are going to struggle to make a fire, have all of your other fire making materials ready already. So like I've got some fine stuff that, I don't know why it burns so well, but it always burns really well. So I've taken that from the environment, and I've put some pine needles here and some pine cones. And even though everything's wet and it's raining like right on my fatwood shavings, I'm still going to get a fire because resin and water don't mix. So that is absolutely the best way that you can ensure that you're going to get fire. But even so, if it is pouring with rain and you know that it's going to continue pouring with rain, build a shelter over your fire. Build like a little ceiling over your fire. If it's tall enough and your fire isn't particularly big, it's going to provide enough shelter for your fire to burn without getting drenched with rain. Okay. Just making very fine shavings here. That should actually be enough. I could do more. Let's try and save my resource for later. Fat wood is always, even if you don't think you're going to use it, if you see it, just like collect it. Keep it in your pocket. You never know. This, for example, is something that I usually keep on me. I don't even know what it is. It's a kind of grass, but it's got such fine little pieces, fine brittle pieces. It's really easy to light with a ferro rod. The problem is, if it's wet, it doesn't light that easily. Whereas if you've got a resinous material, it's not going to mix with water, so you're going to get a fire a whole lot easier. And you can harvest dry wood even in the worst rain. The trick is keeping it dry. So if you find standing deadwood, a tree that's died and it's still standing upright, it's not going to have as much moisture in it as what a branch does that's been lying on the ground for the longest time. So what you can do is look for standing deadwood, chop that log up, see if you can get to the inside of it, and then use the dry wood from there. Especially if you need to do something like make a bow drill fire in wet conditions, it's really, really challenging. So let's see if we can have some success with this. We should could try and just break it up a little, just so we've got some finer fibers, which you usually wouldn't need in fat wood, but just for the heck of it. Okay. I hope the camera can see this. All right. I'm going to use my ferro rod to add a few shavings to that as well. What that does is it allows the heat source to continue for longer. It's the reason why we take fire steels and we shave parts of them off, is because they light the shavings that fall in between there, and it extends the lifetime of the heat source that you're applying to the combustible material. So to give you an example of what I mean by saying that the combustible material might not accept what you're applying to it, the heat you're applying to it. If you have leaves, for example, and you try and use something like a ferro rod to light leaves, you're going to fail every time. Leaves don't burn like that. If, however, you've got a bit of oil or resin and you put the leaves in the burning oil, then the leaves will burn. All right, let's see how we go. Ooh, that burned me. Okay, something's burning there. Oh, it's going. What have you eaten? Oh, what did you eat, sis? All right, and just giving it, like I said, a little bit of wind shelter will help. Now this stuff, for whatever reason, even when it's wet, seems to have a lot of resin in it, and then it burns really well. And if you're really struggling to get a fire going, add a few pine needles. Even when they're wet, they also tend to burn well. And of course, pine cones, even though they might be wet, they also burn well. So like I said, if you found a pine tree, you've really won. All right, so there we've got a fire going, even despite the rainy weather. No, don't eat that. I don't know what you ate that made you vomit like that. Sis. Now, in wet weather, you really have to nurse the fire. And do consider that when your materials are wet, once you put them on the fire, they first have to dry out. Then they only start to catch alight. So think about these things in advance. It gives you enough time to manage your fire and to keep it going. That should go nicely now. You can see my fire, because there's so much smoke, you can also see that the materials are wet. And now because I've got this whole rock here, I'm not losing heat to that side. I'm maintaining the heat just here instead of losing to multiple directions. And I'm adding materials in advance because they first need to dry out before they can actually light. So it looks like I'm making a massive fire here, but really when you add wet materials to a fire, like all of this stuff is wet. Once I add that, it actually saps heat from the fire before it burns. It's a bit of smoky business. Before the fire starts burning, or these materials start burning, they actually sap heat from the fire. So for example, if you're trying to braai a steak and you want to get the perfect medium rare steak, and you go and add more wood to the fire thinking that you're going to increase the heat of that fire, adding wood, even if it's dry, it's first going to absorb heat before it gives off heat. So it needs to light first before it actually adds heat to the system. So for the perfect steak, if your fire is too cold, don't go and add more wood and think that you're going to braai immediately. You're going to have to wait a while for that to actually get hot enough for you to braai that steak. And the other thing that you can do is block off the heat in some areas so that you retain heat in that system. So if you're trying to keep a fire going in wet conditions, consider all of these things. I've placed something dry at the base of the fire so it doesn't draw moisture from the ground. I've got only wet materials to work with, but even so, from the inside of a branch or from the inside of a tree, you can find some dry materials or even resinous materials like fatwood. And then also the materials that you continue to add to the fire, they sap heat first before they add heat to your fire. So do consider all of those things, and then just keep on nursing the fire. Most of the stuff around here, like punkwood, this is from a pine, so it's got a whole lot of resin in it, but right now it's absolutely sopping wet. So we'll dry it out first. You can actually go ahead and stack all your fire making materials on the one side as well and let them dry out systematically. Sitting by a fire like this always reminds me of Hosea 6 verse 6. It says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, knowledge of God. And it just goes to show you God really wants to have a relationship with every single one of us. And it's good to reflect on these things when they come to mind, because it reminds us that God is a father and he looks at us like children, naughty children at that. But it's not his will to judge us, it's his will for us to succeed in life. So when it comes to keeping a fire going in the rain, if for example it's going to rain all night and you really are just going to have an absolute uphill battle trying to keep your fire going, if you're dependent on your fire for heat and for survival, then stay up all night and make sure your fire keeps going if it's raining. Because trying to start a fire in the dark, not an easy task. Believe me, I've tried that before. So keep your fire going throughout the night, sleep during the day if you must. If you're dependent on it for heat, for survival, just do what you've got to do. If you lose a night's sleep, then so be it. You can sleep again the next day. Now, while we're talking about all of the resources you can use to get a fire going in the first place, I'm just going to put this log on here. It can dry out so long. If you can't find fatwood, what you can do is use a branch. This is Port Jackson. Even if you find it standing upright and it's cold and wet, if you look at the branch, maybe it's a tree standing like this. Okay, if you look at the branch, peel the bark off of it. That inner bark will have stayed dry. So what you do is you basically press it flat and peel it off. It's not always that easy, but sometimes. And you just peel that inner bark off. You use all of that to create a tinder bundle, and you just process it. Believe me, if everything else in the environment is wet and you can't find fatwood, inner bark from a tree that has been standing upright is going to be your absolute saving grace. On top of my glove here, what I'm going to do with this bark, and you can see there, the outer bark is going to be what's wet. The inner bark, all of this stuff is usable. So because I've bent it, the outer bark is sort of coming off already. So I'm going to peel off all the outer bark. This stuff might actually be usable. Depends on what you've got. So peel off the outer bark, just like that. That is smoky. Peel off the outer bark. And to get it off, just bend it and then peel the outer bark off. Bend it, peel the outer bark off. And this inner bark, you now take and you can process that into very fine fibers until you've got a usable tinder bundle. I'll show you now. And I mean, I'm talking really fine here. So you're going to process this stuff for quite a bit. So there, I've got something. Here I've got all of that. Removing this outer bark here. And the outer bark's not bad. You can still chuck it on the fire, just as long as you've got a bit more heat on the fire. You're going to take all of this, break it into as fine pieces as possible, until eventually you've got a very fine looking tinder bundle. And I mean, this is not even nearly fine enough, so it's going to take me a while. You can rub it between your hands also. That's too thick. It can go on the fire. And if you're expecting cold or wet weather, make sure that you do this in advance so that you've got a dry tinder bundle sitting somewhere. And if it's a little bit wet, put it near whatever fire you've already got going. So think ahead, plan ahead of time as well. Okay, so I'm just going to keep on separating this, and again and again and again and again. Until I've got really fine fibers. And I'll show you just now how it does actually take a spark. So even if the wood was wet, even if the tree that it's from was wet, this is still going to be pretty dry stuff that was sitting on the inside of the tree. And if you're lucky, you might even find a scorpion when you look in the bark. And then you've got some food as well. And then you just process it, and you just keep on processing that until you've got a really fine bundle. Once you start seeing like really fine fibers, it should be fine, and you can try and light it. Again, I would try and light it on something dry. If you've got fatwood, add it in there. If you've got anything else that you can use as an accelerant or as a starter, use that. Like, make use of what you've got. Once you've got a fire going, it's a lot easier to prepare materials for your next fire, and that would be wisdom as well. As soon as you've got a fire going, make sure that you prepare for your next fire. So put some contingency measures in place. All right, let's see here. Don't need all of that. And the finer the fibers, the less work you're going to have to put into getting that to light. All right. Okay. If it doesn't light, you haven't processed it well enough. Then try again. What can we do to make this better? There's always got to be one thing that's got to be a mission. And today, it's inner bark. Try again. All right. Let's give this a go. And as soon as you have a flame, feed it with something that'll burn. There you go. And once again, we've got fire. So there's two different options there for wet fire making materials. There we go. So that's the fire triangle in a nutshell. Remember that you have to look at all of the environmental factors that play into sapping heat or providing heat, as well as all of the materials that you're using to draw or accept that heat, and how much oxygen and how much wind is available in the environment. Sometimes wind can be a contributing factor to getting a fire going. Sometimes it can just blow your fire out. I hope you find value here. If you've liked this video, remember to hit like and subscribe. Follow me on social media. There's a lot of this stuff on Instagram. And until the next time, live ready. Yeah, we did it. That was good. Let's make some dinner.